Hello, welcome to Lecture 7. Now that we have laid the foundations of the nervous and the endocrine systems as levels of analysis for social behavior, we can turn to development in the next 4 lectures. And the reasoning here is that in order to understand a social behavior that occurs today, we should probably try to understand how our development, all the way back to the fertilized egg, from that point to this moment, contributed to whatever actions we take today. So in this lecture and Lecture 8, I'll be focusing on the period of adolescence. And these lectures largely map on to some of what's covered in Chapter 5, but mostly of Chapter 6 in the Sapolsky text. In Lecture 9, we'll go all the way back to development from birth. And finally, in Lecture 10, we'll examine how sex and gender develop. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is, first of all, talk about some myths and realities about what adolescence actually is and how people behave in adolescence. Then we're going to talk about 5 key facts about the adolescent nervous system. We'll then look at hormones in adolescence. I'm going to give the spotlight to the work of Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, a social neuroscientist who studies adolescence. And finally, we're going to talk about sleep and its role in the social behavior of adolescence. I really like this quote that is in Sapolsky's book in Chapter 6. He wrote, "Think about this. Adolescence and early adulthood are the times when someone is most likely to kill, be killed, leave home forever, invent an art form, help overthrow a dictator, ethnically cleanse a village, devote ourselves to the needy, become addicted, marry outside their group, transform physics, have hideous fashion taste, break their neck recreationally, commit their life to God, mug an old lady, or be convinced that all of history has converged to make this moment the most consequential, the most fraught with peril and promise, the most demanding that they get involved and make a difference." It's an excellent way of describing adolescence and early adulthood, that there's so much that happens during this time period. And so, of course, we got to devote some time in understanding this in social neuroscience in order to understand social behaviors that occur during that particular period of time and later in adulthood. So let's talk a little bit more about adolescence by addressing some of the myths and realities that surround adolescence. Now, there's sort of like 5 myths about adolescence that are out there. First of all, one myth has to do more about just brain development. And this myth was largely the myth that lasted up until about the 1990s, and which was that all brain development really occurred in the first years of life. So people believed that the most important point of brain development, and pretty much entire brain development, occurred in the early years of life. And we're going to soon see that that's not the case at all. That second thing was that, adolescents are just wild and they've lost their minds. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. It's all about those raging hormones. You'll hear this a lot said about adolescence and say, just try to explain everything that's strange about adolescence is about the hormones, or that they're just emotionally immature and they haven't matured yet. And 5, that adolescence itself is a cultural invention, that it's maybe something that the West developed fairly recently in recent decades to, have a way of subscribing or saying what a particular time period of development was. Now, let's take that last myth first, which is that adolescence is a cultural invention. Now, I'm going to grant you that in different cultures, when adolescence occurs and when it ends, and maybe some of the customs of adolescence are different in different cultures. But I think that the period of development, at least in the nervous system and the endocrine system, is really well defined and it really does, it's not something that is just created by culture. In fact, if you go back 400 years ago to William Shakespeare in The Winter's Tale, he wrote, "I would there were no age between 16 and 23, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there's nothing in between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancientry, stealing and fighting." So you can see 400 years ago, Shakespeare's character is saying that, between 16 and 23, well, I just wish that period could be skipped, or that youth would sleep it out because nothing happens except for a lot of sex, disregarding the wishes of their elders and doing a lot of stealing and fighting. So obviously, even back then, this was considered a very fraught period, adolescence. So how are we going to define adolescence? Well, we're going to say that adolescence is the period of life that starts with the biological, hormonal, and physical changes of puberty and ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. All right. So it's basically saying it starts with the onset of puberty and it ends with the person becomes it obtains a stable, independent role in society. And this comes from Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, who we're going to talk more about in this lecture, who's done a lot on the neuroscience of adolescence. Okay. Now you'll notice that means then we don't really have a particular age when it actually occurs. And in some ways, puberty, the onset of puberty is actually happening earlier than it did just decades ago. It also says that, you could be well into your 20s before adolescence is finished. Now, let's talk about some key facts about the adolescent nervous system. So going from myths now to facts. Some key things you should know just about the nervous system of adolescents. Now, key fact number 1 is that gray matter volume peaks in adolescence and then declines after that. Now, remember that gray matter is the cell bodies and the dendrites, okay? So when you look at a scan of the brain and you can see it in terms of a picture, you'll see a lot of gray matter. The gray matter are those cell bodies and the dendrites. And we see that gray matter peaks at adolescence. And it peaks a little bit earlier for girls than it does for boys, as you can see in this diagram. And then it starts to drop off. What's happening after that point? Well, it has to do with pruning of neurons. You see, there are two kind of main growth spurts in our nervous system. The first one happens in utero, when our fetus is developing. So from in utero to about 18 months of age, there's an overproduction of cells in the brain and an overproduction of connections between all those neurons. And so we get a lot of neurons that are being created during that particular time period. And then there's a second growth spurt that happens again between the ages of 10 and 13. And you again see a lot of these cell bodies being formed and these neurons. And so that represents this peak that you see in this graph. Interestingly, during that age period of 10 to 13, you don't see a lot of emotional problems. So it's not that the extra cells in the brain is actually what's causing all the problems of adolescence. In fact, most people think of that period when the neurons are actually being produced as a latent stage. That is, it seems fairly quiet in development. Now, after this peak, what we see then throughout adolescence is a lot of pruning and organizing of the neural pathways. There's a phrase that people use when they talk about adolescent brain development, which is use it or lose it. That is, if certain neurons and certain pathways are not being used at that particular time, it's very likely that the neurons will have programmed cell death, and the neuron will actually just die and then be reused for other purposes in the brain. And this happens mostly during sleep. Okay, so you get this laying down of neural pathways and the pruning of neurons happening during adolescence. Key fact number 2 is that white matter is increasing during adolescence. Now, what is white matter? Now, white matter is really the myelination of axons. And so it's happening as along all those axons that have been making connections between different neurons, myelination is happening at a very great rate. And as it happens along each of the axons, as your neurons create these myelinated areas along the axon, it increases the speed that an action potential can travel. And we talked about this in lecture 3. And in fact, it increases it like 100 times. So it's very much increasing the speed at which these messages can be passed among the neurons. The refractory period of the neuron also becomes 30 times shorter. And you remember that the refractory period is that time before the neuron can fire again. So it's actually speeding up the rest period. Like it's not going to rest as long there before it fires again with this myelination. Interestingly, by the way, myelination continues well into middle age. And so we keep doing this from adolescence onward, but it sort of starts really at a great rate during adolescence. Key fact number 3, there is some neurogenesis during adolescence. Now, you remember I told you that there was these great increases of cell bodies that happens at, from fetal time to about 18 months of age, and then again between 10 and 13. But there continues to be some neurogenesis that happens during adolescence. So some neurons in the hippocampus and maybe elsewhere, including the limbic system, are being created even after all that original development. And you can see this discussed in Sapolsky's chapter 5 if you want to understand a little bit more about neurogenesis. I'm trying to point out, though, that neurogenesis isn't as great as it was at earlier stages, and it's just happening at different places at different times. So it starts to modestly decline after adolescence. So you continue to have neurogenesis well through adulthood, but the rate of neurogenesis is going down after adolescence is over. Okay, so that means that we do have some new neurons being formed during adolescence, but it's not to any great extent. Key fact number 4 is that neuroplasticity happens a lot during adolescence. And this kind of goes back to the last fact and back to key fact number 1, which is that, the nervous system is reorganizing its structure, its functions, and its connections through neuroplasticity. And this is happening a lot during adolescence. That we get these changes in the external and the internal environment, and by internal environment, I mean, for instance, hormones, that affect neural pruning and strengthening. So it's not so much that the neuron itself dies. It could also be that you have synaptic pruning, where certain synapses are cut back and pruned. Or there could be other synapses that are going to be connected and are strengthened through neuroplasticity. As a result of all this pruning, the synaptic pruning, neurons dying, and so on, and this strengthening of also other connections, what it means then is that adolescents are learning fast. They have a lot of synaptic plasticity that goes on during this period. And so they can quickly acquire from their environment, from these experiences they have, lots of new information, new behaviors, and so on. It's also interesting is that addiction occurs more easily during this period too. And it turns out that people who end up getting addicted, like for instance to cigarettes or to drugs during adolescence, have a harder time getting rid of it later on. Because of all of this sort of strengthening and this pruning that's happening there, you kind of like learn very efficiently to how to be addicted to whatever that particular drug is. I had a father who, my dad actually learned to smoke in his teens and had such a hard time all the way up into his death when he was nearly 80. He was still trying to get rid of his smoking habits, but his smoking had started back when he was a teen. It was just very hard for him to ever get rid of that addiction. And the other thing that's important is that the link between stress and depression is going to be stronger now too. And so you remember that the hippocampus, for example, keeps track of your stress and the events that are occurring around stress. And so you actually start to learn more about changes in your environment and what causes you to be stressed and what you have control over and so on. And so that kind of learning perhaps is going to make it easier for a person to make a connection between stress and depression. So it becomes more difficult then to kick as we get older because of these links that are developed during adolescence. All right, let's move on to key fact number 5, and that is the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature. And some people believe that this is actually what signals the end of adolescence, is when your frontal cortex is finally fully mature. Now, that means that not only is it the last part of the brain to fully mature, it means that the brain itself is the last organ in the body to mature, which means then that our brain doesn't fully develop for about 2.5 decades. So around the time we're 25, we can kind of maybe rest assured that our brain is done maturing. But even in the brain, that means that the frontal cortex, the front part of our brain, is the last part of the brain to mature. That it actually starts more towards the back of the cortex, back in the occipital lobe, the temporal parietal lobes. They're going to develop and mature more quickly than the frontal cortex is. And the frontal cortex then is that last part of the brain to mature. So what are the consequences of that? What does it mean to have our frontal cortex not fully mature by a time we're reaching adolescence? Well, you have to keep in mind that the frontal cortex is where executive functioning takes place. And as I said, it's the last to develop, and executive functioning is quite important to our everyday life. Executive functioning is where the brain is really controlling our activation, our initiation of behavior, our arousal levels, our effort. So, getting started on a task, paying attention, finishing work, it's all going to really depend a lot on your executive functioning. It also is where emotion is going to be controlled. So it's going to help us to tolerate frustration. It's going to help us to think before we act or speak on our emotions. Okay. And also executive functioning, you can kind of think of it as being involved in the analysis of issues that might be presented to us. So it helps us to take issues apart, analyze them, and maybe organize new ideas from the issues that are brought up to our attention. So without a fully developed frontal cortex, we don't have a fully developed executive functioning center here. And so a lot of these functions that you see listed here are going to be hindered. They're not going to be fully developed, and they're going to be more difficult for the adolescent brain. All right, so those are my 5 key facts about the adolescent nervous system: that gray matter volume peaks in adolescence and then declines after that, that white matter increases during adolescence, that there's some neurogenesis during adolescence, neuroplasticity happens a lot during adolescence, and finally the frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature. So keep those 5 key facts in mind as we continue to go through the rest of this lecture. Now, the next thing I want to do is turn to hormones a little bit and talk about hormones in adolescence. And I will be talking much more about hormones when we talk about the development of sex and gender, but just keep in mind that we have this sort of tsunami of hormones that occur in adolescence. So you remember that the definition that Blakemore gives for adolescence, it's the onset of puberty, when all these hormones are suddenly brought to the fore. And you can see this diagram actually shows you pretty well what the developmental course is for estrogen and testosterone. So you can see that estradiol, one of the estrogens, is actually going to peak there at puberty. It's going to go up right after that. And that testosterone also starts to increase greatly during adolescence. So we have these 2 big hormones that are having a huge impact on our development during adolescence. So puberty triggers hormones that lead to changes in sexual secondary characteristics that occur across adolescence. Testosterone, for example, in males, is going to cause hair to grow in parts of the body that didn't have hair before. It's going to cause changes in the sex organs in terms of their development. It's going to lead to boys having erections, having them have body odor, etc. That the estrogens in girls is going to cause breasts to be developed. We're going to get widening of hips, pubic hair, menstruation starts. And then we also have progesterone in girls in terms of the lining of the uterus and getting changes there as well. So these are hormones that are causing physical changes, right, in the characteristics of the body. And what you see in that picture up at the top is sort of like a orange kind of triangle there. And what's trying to show you there is that our body is very much affected by these hormones. But as you get older, it's less and less being affected by the hormones, even though the hormones are really high. So you see that during adolescence. The slope of that line continues to go down during adolescence. So by the time we get to the end of that period of adolescence, we're hardly being affected by those hormones anymore in terms of our sexual secondary characteristics, but they're still quite high and they still have much impact then on our behavior. So these hormones also influence the nervous system. And here are just a few examples. For instance, they influence the striatum during reward processing. They're going to affect the amygdala during emotion processing. And the MPFC and the TPJ that are involved in theory of mind and helping us understand other people's perspectives also are affected by these hormones, both in males, testosterone and estradiol in females, during social cognitive reasoning. So let me show you that in a little bit more detail. Let's talk about testosterone in terms of consequences for social behavior. Here are just a few sort of observations about some of the consequences of testosterone. Now keep in mind that both boys and girls can have testosterone, but boys have it at much higher levels. That increases in testosterone in boys predicts activity in the ventral striatum after high-risk gambles. So when boys are playing things that are really risky and there's a big payoff, boys that have higher testosterone levels just overall are more likely to show bigger activity in the ventral striatum, which we know is really sensitive to rewards. That social rewards themselves may be more important too for boys who are high in testosterone. And that higher testosterone is associated with more aggression in boys, but this is probably moderated by social variables. And you can see Sapolsky talk about this in chapter 4, and he comes up with this again and talks about it in chapter 6. So higher testosterone doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get more aggression, because there's also going to be some other social variables in the environment that are going to interact with that higher testosterone level. What about over in girls? Well, we can look at estradiol, which is one of these estrogen hormones. It increases in estradiol in girls is associated with greater risk-taking for them as well, and less behavioral inhibition. So that means as their estradiol goes up, they're more likely to take risks and have less inhibition, which means that they're less likely to put the brakes on. And it's interesting, though, for girls is that's going to actually fluctuate with their menstrual cycle. Estradiol seems to affect the rough and tumble play of female rats during their adolescence. So this is like research that they've done with rodents, where you can actually see that estradiol is related to how female rats play in terms of the rough and tumble play. And so it's likely that this also has some impact on the way human girls actually play. And also estradiol levels also shape some of the cognitive processes. So it affects the way we think about things in terms of social situations. So that's one of the ways that estradiol can also have an important role. So my main point here is just to show you that these hormones that we really think about probably more for their secondary characteristics that they change during puberty and adolescence also are having a big impact on social behavior. All right, so what I want to do next is shine the spotlight on the work of one social neuroscientist who does work on adolescent development. Now, there's other people I could also talk about, but I just thought it might be nice to kind of just look a little bit more into detail of this particular neuroscientist's work in adolescent development as sort of a way to showcase the way you could use social neuroscience to understand adolescent development. And that person I want to focus on here for a bit is Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, who's at Cambridge University in the Department of Psychology there. Blakemore actually got her PhD from Oxford, I believe, and she worked with a guy named Chris Frith there. Her father is actually a well-known, respected neuroscientist himself. I think he does more like vision or something. He's not interested in social aspects of behavior as much. But you can see here that she's holding up a book that she wrote called Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain that I'd highly recommend to you. It was a winner of the Royal Society Prize for Science Books back in 2018. She also has a really happening website here, the Blakemore Lab, where you can go ahead and learn more about the research that they're doing and the people who work in her lab. So I recommend that if you have some time, go check out the Blakemore Lab's website. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and show you 3 lines of research that come from her lab. The first one I want to do is talk about some research that she published in her group in 2021 called The Importance of Friendships on the Adolescent Brain. And you can see that Andrik Becht and other colleagues there are also authors on this paper. And the title of the paper is Beyond the Average Brain, Individual Differences in Social Brain Development are Associated with Friendship Quality. So in this study, they looked at 299 Dutch adolescents from puberty to their late 20s, and they looked at them at 3 time points. Now, I should say that they're not all starting at puberty. It's like some of these participants are 18 when they start, others are 20 or 25. So they have 3 time points, but they all start the study at different ages, okay? So it's a way to have sort of like a mix of a longitudinal design that's also cross-sectional. And in this study, the 2 main things I want to focus on here is they looked at friendship quality. So they asked them to fill out some measures of the kind of friends they have and how extensive that friendship network is. And then they also looked at MRI scans, not functional ones. They looked at structural MRI scans. And what they wanted to see here is they want to look at key parts of the social brain to see if they change over time and whether or not there's any relationship to their friendship. So what you can see here is maybe not in such great detail, but on the left we have the surface area of 4 areas, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior STS, the TPJ, and the precuneus, okay? And then on the right we have those same areas in terms of their cortical thickness. So cortical thickness, the lower it is on the y-axis, that means there's more thinning going on, that there's pruning that's been occurring, and that the brain is developing more. So remember I told you this happens in adolescence, that we get, we're going to get that gray matter to decline because of more pruning and more changes that are happening. It's thinning of the cortical thickness. So it's basically like a measure of how much the gray volume is going down. The surface area also tells us this. It means that if you have it going down on the left part of these pictures, we're going to also see evidence of the brain developing, that we have more pruning. So we can kind of see how quickly it's changing here. And on the x-axis, you can see different ages going from 10 up to 25, 26, somewhere in the late 20s. And some of these areas kind of go pretty quickly in terms of how much they're changing, and others are a little bit slower, but there's just generally this trend. Each of the little colored lines there, you can see there's usually 3 dots for a line. That represents the 3 different times that a male or a female in this study was tested. And the blue are the males, and The yellowish ones are females. And there's really no difference between males and females in terms of how this process goes. Some of the surface areas are a little bit different. There's a difference between boys and girls in terms of their brain size. And so some of these areas might be a little bit different. But otherwise, there's not really any big gender differences here going across those different 4 social brain areas. All right, so what did she find in this study, and she and her colleagues? Well, first of all, they saw a lot of individual variation in brain development. So this is kind of important point. This is like showing you that if you kind of pick out any one little participant there, where there's like a line of 3 dots being connected, that's just one person's brain changes over this time period. And you can see that some people are actually changing more quickly. That is, that their line drops more quickly. Other people, it's flatter. So it's kind of showing us that at different ages and among different people, there are different patterns in the way in which people vary and how their brain develops. Okay, so it's not like everybody's following the same line here exactly in sync with each other. They're actually showing lots of variation in their brain development. The other thing that's interesting, though, and this is the other key finding from the study, is that those people who had faster brain development, which would be indicated by people who have steeper lines going downwards, those people had higher quality friendships over time. Now, by this, I mean that when you asked them about their friendships, they had these deeper, richer friendships. They were also the people who had faster brain development. Their lines were going down more quickly. Now, it's not meant to be a causal relationship. They're not depicting it here. It's correlational. That is, it could be that people who are destined to have faster brain development are the kind of people that have higher quality friendships to begin with. Or it could be, as a result of high quality friendships, your brain develops more quickly. But either way, we just know at this point that there's a correlation here between faster brain development over this time period and higher quality friendships. So that's one interesting finding from that study as well. All right, moving on to a second study. This is a paper that they published in 2012, Blakemore and Robbins, in which they reviewed studies that mainly came from Blakemore's lab group, where they compared adolescents to adults on risk-taking and mentalizing. Okay, so risk-taking, they gave them tasks in which adults and adolescents could do something risky. Mentalizing means that they have to think about what another person's mental state is, right? Okay, so what do we see in that review paper? Well, in terms of risk-taking, they looked at ventral striatum activity, and they found that ventral striatum actually differentiated between adolescents and adults when they played a risky driving game. And we're going to talk more about this risky driving game at the next lecture. But you can see here that you can make risky decisions while you're playing a virtual driving game. And the adolescents could be doing this with their peers present or alone. Or if you were a young adult or adults, you could also do this alone or have a peer with you. And you can see that in the top there that the adolescents are actually more likely to make risky decisions when their peers are present than they are when they're alone. In fact, when they're alone, they're not actually significantly any different from young adults or adults in terms of their risky decisions. But having a peer around makes them take riskier decisions. And likewise, you can see that those risky decisions are associated in the bottom graph with changes in their ventral striatum. So when their peers are around them, they're making these risky decisions, you can see that they're more likely to show activity in the ventral striatum, much more activity compared to when they're alone. There's not really any differences for young adults and adults when they have a peer present versus alone in their ventral striatum. So what that tells us is that perhaps part of that risk-taking is being driven by the rewards that come from showing off in front of your peers, taking risks in front of them. And that's sort of a reward in itself. And so maybe that's what's driving that sort of risky behavior that we're seeing in these adolescents. In terms of mentalizing, they looked across adolescence and they see that there's sort of a developmental shift that happens from anterior to posterior cortical activity when people try to infer the intentions of others. So if you look at young adolescent brains, when they're trying to understand the intentions of other people, they tend to use their medial prefrontal cortex to do this. But as you compare this to adults tend to go more towards the fusiform gyrus and the TPJ, the temporal parietal junction, to infer the intentions of others. We're going to talk more about this when we get into empathy in later lectures in this course. And you'll see that for adults, we tend to focus a lot on the TPJ and the fusiform gyrus to understand empathy and mentalizing and so on. But at this point, when you look at young adolescents, they haven't really started using that part of their brain yet. They're tending to focus more on the medial prefrontal cortex, which, as I mentioned to you, isn't even fully developed yet. And that seems to be the place where they end up using more of their brain to try to understand the intentions of other people. Third thing I want to just mention is kind of goes back to that first study that I already mentioned of Blakemore, is that when adolescents don't take risks, it's usually because of friends. So adolescents are generally risk takers, right? So they take a lot of risks. But the one kind of risk taking that they try to avoid is social risk taking. That is, if there's a chance that they could lose a friendship or not get approval from their friends, they won't take the risks. So they don't want to be excluded. And we're going to talk more about the importance of exclusion and being included among adolescents at the next lecture. So if you kind of emphasize then that, or focus on the fact that adolescents really want to avoid being cut off from their friends, they really want to be rewarded with them. And then you combine it with some sort of risk-taking for more dangerous kinds of behaviors, you can actually get quite problematic behaviors happening among adolescents, right? So if the risk-taking about some problematic behavior, let's say drinking alcohol at a young age, if that is happening because the adolescent doesn't want to risk being excluded from their friends, because that's the risk they want to avoid, is being excluded, then they're more likely to engage in that problematic behavior if those two things are tied together. And so here's a nice example from that paper that I mentioned there, that when you look at different kinds of risk domains, the expected involvement in these risk behaviors is related to how much social benefit they think they're going to get from it. So you can see that aggressive and illegal behaviors are more likely to occur the more the adolescent perceives that there's a social benefit from engaging in that risk behavior. You can see that substance abuse also goes up the more an individual thinks that that's going to be beneficial. There's one thing that's kind of going down there, and that's risky sex. And you can see their social benefit of being involved in risky sex is the more they think that there's a benefit of that, the more likely it is that they're not going to engage in risky sex. But the other ones, risky drinking, substance abuse, and aggressive and illegal behaviors, tend to go up the more the adolescent views that as a social benefit by engaging in those risk behaviors. So that's just, again, something to keep in mind, that if adolescents are already taking a lot of risks, and we combine that with what rewards they might get from their friends, you got some kind of dangerous combinations here going on here, where you could end up with addictive behaviors or other kinds of behaviors that are destructive to their social life. Okay, so that ends our little spotlight on Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about her research at the next lecture. But you're getting a sense of the kind of stuff that she can do at Cambridge, and she works with colleagues all over the world in these kind of very large research projects where you can get lots of participants and the kinds of questions that she's interested in. So again, I really want to recommend that you check out some of her work and maybe even look at her book. Now, the final topic that I want to cover for today's lecture is the effects of sleep and on adolescence. So I talked a lot about this at the last lecture, about how sleep can have an impact on hormones and the nervous system. So let's go ahead and look at that in adolescence. Now, it turns out that we get a lot of sleep deprivations in adolescence, as many of you know, and in fact, a lot of this continues through the university years and young adulthood. One of the big problems is that schools around the world don't seem to acknowledge the importance of sleep deprivation. So many schools actually start too early, or they have a lot of activities that occur before school, even though most pediatricians recommend that schools don't start until 8:30 in the morning. All right, so you've got kids that have to be at school by 7, maybe they have to go to a practice at 6 a.m., and you might say, well, don't they just go to bed earlier? The problem is they don't actually do that. What happens is most adolescents still can't go to sleep till after 10:30 or 11 o'clock. So if you start their day earlier, they're going to actually end up getting less sleep. And so that means that students essentially become like shift workers, like we talked about at the last lecture. That is, they're going to be sleep deprived because they didn't get a full night's sleep. And that means then that things are going to be worse off for them. So as I said, students don't just stay up later when school starts later. So if you look at schools where they've change the start time to like 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, it's not that kids just end up staying up later then because they can sleep in. They tend to go to bed at the same time, regardless of what time they have to be up in the morning. So they actually end up getting more sleep if school and its activities start later. In fact, in France, they've mandated that schools can't start before 9 a.m. for those who are between 15 and 18 years old. And so we have plenty of data there to show that those adolescents are not just staying up later because they don't have to be at school until 9. Now, most teens can't go to sleep until 10:30. Like I said, this seems to be something that is a common aspect about teen life and adolescence, that perhaps due to shifting circadian times and perhaps due to pubertal hormones, there's a problem here where they just can't really go to sleep much before 10:30. So if you wake up at 5:30 to get to whatever that activity is, that means you're only going to get about 7 hours of sleep at best, which is probably an hour short for what they actually need. So during those adolescent years, getting 8 hours of sleep is really important to have a good functioning brain, okay? So what are some consequences of sleep deprivation in adolescence? What we see is, unfortunately, things like an increased risk of suicide, depression, and risk-taking when adolescents are more sleep deprived. Then you also combine it with the fact that a lot of them are learning to drive, or they've now starting to drive and they're inexperienced. And so now here they are, inexperienced, and they're sleep deprived, and so you're going to end up getting more accidents and more fatalities because of these sleep deprived, inexperienced drivers. It can affect their social relationships, which then in turn affects their sleep quality, which is a vicious circle. So it could affect their relationships with their parents, their siblings, but also their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their friends. So sleep deprivation, just like we talked about at the last lecture, can affect your social relationships, which then in turn causes you not to sleep as well because you're having problems with your social relationships. It interacts with hormones. And as I said, staying up late becomes sort of preferred for a variety of reasons for the adolescent. Now, you think about it, for most of our evolutionary history, there would have been no light after the sun went down, right? And so there would be very little light, and the brain would then have to be signaling that it's time to go to sleep. And I also mentioned this in the last lecture about how parts of our brain are sensitive to the light, like the pineal gland and melatonin and so on, that if we have these kind of our life is sort of synced with light outside, and then having it light on all the time because it's artificial, then that means that we're probably going to be changing the body's circadian system. So in today's world, there's all sorts of light, and even blue spectrum light that comes from screens, like computer screens and phones and so on, that affects the body's circadian system. And then those hormones that would be normally telling us to go to sleep are not being released like they normally would. And so therefore we're not being signaled to go to sleep at the times that we should probably be going to sleep. So this is that interaction that's happening. So as we go through adolescence and now there's this preference to staying up late and you're using lots of light to do this, it's affecting the hormones what actually cause us to go to sleep, and therefore we don't sleep as efficiently. So I bring all of this up because I just want to have this as a idea that just sort of gets layered through as we think about development and adolescence, is how much sleep is the person getting? Because as we talked about at that last lecture, in lecture 6, that sleep is really going to be important for our social processes in lots of different ways. And so if you haven't actually watched that lecture yet, I recommend that you go back and look at that, because it affects not only adolescents, but adults as well. So summing up, in this lecture, we've talked about some of the myths and realities of adolescence. I've talked about 5 key facts about the adolescent nervous system that make this a really special time for lots of different reasons. We've talked about some of the hormones in adolescence that are primarily released because of puberty and then have other effects on social behavior. I gave the spotlight to the work of Sarah-Jayne Blakemore at Cambridge University and how she uses neuroscience to study adolescence. And finally, we've been talking about sleep and how sleep-deprived adolescence has all sorts of other effects as well. Now, in the next lecture, what I'm going to do is just take 3 specific topics: emotion processing, risk-taking, and social acceptance and exclusion, and really drill into them some more by looking at some studies, specific studies on each of those 3 areas. So for now, that's all I have, and I hope that I'll see you at the next lecture.